Hey everyone, before we get into today's show, I have something so exciting to share with all of you. And that is that I am starting work on my next book, which is going to explore something that is a little bit terrifying and something that makes me very uncomfortable, and that is vulnerability. And the reason why this terrifies me and makes me uncomfortable is because I am not a vulnerable person. I'm specifically going to be looking at vulnerability and leadership. But here is the best part. I want to include you in the book. I am looking for stories, insights, and experiences from all of you leaders out there who have been vulnerable at work, whether that ended up helping or hurting you. If you want to be featured in my upcoming book and a soon-to-be-released podcast exploring vulnerability and leadership, then please take a few minutes to answer some questions that you can find at thevulnerabiliesurvey.com. Again, that's thevulnerabiliesurvey.com. I will be sharing much more on this in the coming weeks and months, but for now, I'm looking forward to reading what you have to say about vulnerability and leadership. This episode is brought to you by Namely. With workforces continuing to evolve, it's more important than ever to keep in pace with the nature of business. But it can be even harder to stay ahead and keep employees connected and engaged. That's why you should check out Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that offers everything you need to set you up for success in the new year, so that you can tackle any curveballs that 2022 throws your way. Namely helps you easily adapt to the ever-changing workplace and maintain a great employee experience, whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees. With onboarding, performance management, and intuitive benefits enrollment, all in one connected and modern platform. Plus, Namely can streamline your payroll, time tracking, and vacation requests so that you can be everyone's favorite HR leader no matter how your company grows. Companies are built on people. Don't let either fail. Stay ahead and learn more by making the switch to Namely. Learn more about making the switch to Namely today at namely.com. Don't wait, that's Namely, NAMELY.com.
It means it's when you open up and share things about yourself that allow others to realize that, one, there's a relatability, that you are not, in fact, perfect, that you are constantly looking to learn and evolve and looking to others for input. And it really allows people to realize that in the worst of times, that others are maybe feeling what they feel. Maybe they're scared, maybe they're unsure, maybe they're not sure. It's okay to laugh. And when you're trying to engage small groups or larger groups, that vulnerability is a really important aspect of breaking down barriers.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of The Future of Work. My guest today is Lara Abrash. She is the chair and CEO of Deloitte Touche LLP. Lara, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me today.
What a lot of people don't know is that I had to practice saying your first and last name like 20 times before we actually got on the podcast. So I hope I actually got it right this time.
Well, you did a great job. I will tell you, we're going to talk, I'm sure, today about how you engage other people, and making sure you say their name properly is actually, for me, like an 8 or a 9 out of 10. So thank you for taking the time to make sure you did that. It matters to me.
Oh, I'm sure. I would think that that's like a very basic thing, right? Call somebody by their actual name. Before we get started talking about some of the topics that I had for today, why don't you give us a little bit of background information about you? I actually read some interviews that you did a little while ago about your childhood and how you figured out what you wanted to do, how you fell in love with accounting. So share how you got to where you are today, and maybe a little bit about the company in case people are not familiar with it.
Well, I'll start with the company first, and maybe I'll get to a little bit about me. So Deloitte Touche LLP, we are the audit and assurance aspect of the overall Deloitte brand. It's a really important job that we do each and every day. Our people are essentially responsible. We're gatekeepers to the capital markets. So when I try to put this in simple terms, Jacob, when people are taking their moms, their dads, their aunts, their uncles' money from savings accounts and they're making decisions to put it into a stock market or anything like that, they're really relying on the information they get, and they're doing it without question. And that's really our job every day, to come in and fulfill that responsibility with trust. If you back up, I would say there's probably two key aspects to my passion for what we do and what I think is interesting about the role I've been asked to play. One is I have a huge passion for the profession of accounting. When I was growing up, I had, and I would just say it was pure luck, I had the ability to take an accounting class in my seventh grade. And we did the books and records for Firehouse 123. And I remember having this sensation during this, and it's going to really be really odd to people, particularly those that have this weird view of accounting, to say, well, what sort of feeling were you getting? And I describe this when I talk about me upbringing my kids. I have a 17 and 18, soon to be 18-year-old today. And my son, who was 5 at the time, I wanted to teach him what love was. And I said, when mommy walks up to you, what's the feeling you get? And he said, I get a warm sensation and my stomach rumbles. And I said, well, that's the feeling of love. And that was the feeling I had for Firehouse 123. I loved it. And it took me, of course, getting through college to figure out what profession was out there and what I could do. And I was so happy to do it. Accounting is a great career. It's a great way, through understanding how money works, how people make money, to understand how business and industry works. So I've loved it. And we could talk, of course, all day about it. But probably the other thing you may have heard is the impact my mom has had on me. And we'll talk a lot about women today, women leadership. But I'll just say, and I can share a lot of my mom's stories for later, but she was and is a force for me to realize at the time I was entering the workforce that many women like her and others before her had really laid a path for us. And it really is our responsibility as women leaders to continue to rise each other up. Now, today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of other people that need to have opportunity to be successful. But I'll say my mom, and I'll tell all the squishy stories, Jacob, is with plenty of time together, what she did. But I would say those two things have really led me to a place where I feel I have a responsibility. And quite frankly, what gives me the most energy is to help our people.
Well, I think you can continue on that story with your mom around what she did, because yeah, I frequently tell stories about my family. My wife shares stories about her family. So I'd love to hear the role that your mom played and how that helped.
Well, I'll start with when my mom was growing up. She was raised in the early 40s to early 50s. She was the oldest of three. She started in Brooklyn and then eventually made her way out to Long Island, which at the time, for the older folks on the phone, you'll know was sort of a rite of passage to get out of the five boroughs of New York City to get out to Long Island. But when she was raised as the oldest and she graduated from high school, at that time, this was a very appropriate response. And I'm not saying it was the right response, but appropriate response. Her parents essentially told her the next steps for her were either to go to a vocational school to learn how to be a secretary or perhaps a nurse, or find a man to take care of her. I mean,
Yeah.
that was a very clear and straight cut path for her. Ironically, her brother, who was the middle child, got to go to college because he was a male and became an accountant. If you fast that forward, my mom ended up marrying my dad. They had four of us. They ended up getting divorced. And I was essentially raised for many years by my mom. She remarried. But she, during this period of time of raising four children, really embraced the movement that was taking place here in the US in the 60s. And it was I saw her through those eyes. I saw her embracing a movement, and I saw her commitment to doing the right thing. And this was the same woman who often worked two jobs every day,
Yeah.
where she was working, somewhere and then working as a waitress at night. And she would say to me, baby, you could be whatever you want to be. We did the path, we did the hard work to get you to where you are. And that was really instilled in me. And she showed me what work ethic and hard work could do. Matter of fact, she went back and got herself that college degree. And we
Wow.
both got our degrees within 1 year of each other. And it was really that example that when I did enter the workforce, it's always been behind me that I've got this special wind of somebody telling me I could do something. And that really does matter. I mean, there's a lot
Yeah.
of other things that go into it, but it was important to me.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's amazing the sacrifices that parents make for their kids. We have a soon-to-be 6-year-old and a soon-to-be 2-year-old, and so my wife and I are constantly like thinking about all the things that we're trying to do to make their lives better and to teach them valuable life lessons. And So I can totally relate to the role that your mom played in shaping who you are. I know that one of the things that you are very passionate about, and I saw again another interview that you did, and it was the three values that you say are important for leaders, which are vulnerability, empathy, and compassion. And this is very interesting for me because my next book, which I don't actually think I've shared this with anybody yet, but the next book that I'm working on, which will come out, I think, at the beginning of 2023, is going to be all about vulnerability and the role that it plays in leadership and why it's so crucial. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about vulnerability because I'm really curious to hear your perspectives on this. The first one is, what does vulnerability actually mean to you?
Yeah, so for me, it means it's when you open up and share things about yourself that allow others to realize that one, there's a relatability, that you are not in fact perfect, that you are constantly looking to learn and evolve and looking to others for input. And it really allows people to realize that in the worst of times, that others are maybe feeling what they feel. Maybe they're scared, maybe they're unsure, maybe they're not sure. It's okay to laugh.
Yeah.
And when you're trying to engage small groups or larger groups, that vulnerability is a really important aspect of breaking down barriers. And I think it's been important in particular. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit the last few years when there's so much
Oh yeah.
uncertainty for not all of us to feel alone.
Yeah. Can you share a time, or do you have a particular story or moment in mind where you were vulnerable at work and the impact that it had on your team or the person who you were vulnerable with?
Well, so I took this role as the CEO of our audit business about 6 months before the onset of the pandemic. And by the way, I'm not a big fan of telling pandemic stories because at some point they get old and we have to look forward. But it's at least a worthwhile recognition that I was a relatively young leader in this role. And I realized that we were going through a seismic moment for our people. And it wasn't just how their jobs were going to get done every day, but what was happening outside their doors. We have a large part of our organization that is 23, 25, 26 years old that may not have the scars that we have for all the things we've gone through. And so I thought it was really important from day one to have a direct communication with our entire organization. So I started having weekly calls with all 15,000 of our people. And much of the call, I would talk about things like inside and outside Deloitte. The outside Deloitte was a way for me to share with my perspective without slant, without politics, the facts around what was going on. But I also used it as a time to tell stories and to talk about my own fears about what was going on. I have an 80-year-old mom who has rheumatoid arthritis who was incredibly scared. I was incredibly scared for what this all meant for her, what it must feel like to be someone who's older right now, what it felt like for my high school kids who didn't know when they were going to see their friends again, whether, as I said earlier, it was okay to laugh, and that I felt laughing to be a great emotion. But in the moment of this, it was those calls and that ability to tell people that I was, no matter being the CEO or the first year at our firm, all of us were going through the same emotions, and it leveled us all out. And quite frankly, I felt like we were going to just go through this together.
Yeah. So it sounds like you use that as a time to shift. So was that a particular story when you were talking about your mom, when you were talking about your family? Was there like a particular moment where you shared something and then you just realized that people were connecting with you, they were letting down their guard, they were, trusting you?
Yeah, it really was. It was really during the onset of that pandemic. I've been in the firm for a long time. I'd like to say I have a lot of leadership traits that I probably am known for. I don't think I was known for being a connector broadly, like I became at that point. I was definitely in project teams, somebody who always knew how to put people at ease and how to engage, but having the ability to do it over large groups, it became a brand
Yeah.
about who I was. And I think I realized it after the first or second call, the number of emails and notes I got from our people about how appreciative they were. They've never seen a CEO be so open with them. And quite honestly, having them feel like we were all in it in this together.
Mm.
And when I use words like we're a family and we're here to help each other, they actually believed it. So I would say it was at that point it became real to me that one, what I did in smaller circles actually had an effect in larger circles in ways that I didn't think it could. And
Yeah.
it was a reminder to keep doing it.
One of the pieces of feedback that I keep hearing from people when I talk to them about vulnerability or compassion or stuff like that is, what happens if I'm vulnerable or I open up with somebody or I'm transparent with them and they throw it back in my face? Maybe they use it against me intentionally or unintentionally. Why do you want to open yourself up to that? Why share stories about your family or your fears? What if somebody in a meeting says, hey, we shouldn't trust Lara? Remember that time she said that she was scared? She shouldn't be CEO. She doesn't know what she's doing. Has anybody ever thrown being vulnerable back at you? I don't know if that's ever happened, but I'd be curious to hear.
Uh, it hasn't happened, but there were times I wondered, I once teared up in a meeting, and an
Mm,
important meeting. And the other day, somebody said to me, that's what makes me different and special. And at that moment, I felt weak. But
yeah,
I think honestly, Jacob, I think it's balanced with it. It's not, we're not just one dimensional.
yeah,
So we're not just vulnerable. I may be vulnerable, but I also have courage and I make the decisions that are right for most. It may not be right for an individual. And I think when someone sees the multi dimensions of someone, the vulnerability is an important part. It's like a tip of the spear,
yeah.
but in itself is not the person. So I do think that, it doesn't mean, by the way, it doesn't mean everybody likes to be with people that are vulnerable because it requires them to either engage or maybe have a passive regressive reaction like, oh yeah, this is great, but I'm going to walk out of the room. So I'm not saying that on those calls of 15,000 people that everybody hung up the phone and was like, this is the best. But I'm not trying to make everybody happy. I'm trying to make the masses, the far majority, feel comfortable.
Yeah.
So what I would say is if someone said that to you, I always would try to think about, well, what is it about that person? I wouldn't jump right into, by the way, telling mommy stories that I wouldn't do, but test the waters with people about their openness to engaging at a more personal level. And they really are not there. You sort of have to decide, is it worth, really
Yeah.
overcoming?
And just out of curiosity, what would you do if somebody, it might be kind of a hard question to answer, but if somebody took one of your vulnerabilities and threw it back at you in a meeting or in a conversation, how would you even respond to that? Do you think you would just close back up and just be like, that's it, not sharing anything personal with anybody else anymore, ever?
Definitely not. I mean, I think at the end of the day, what we've learned is we're human beings, and I think not everybody is where they need to be on the journey. If an
Yeah.
individual said to me, I don't want to hear it, maybe I'd respect them and say, well, they're not ready to go there, and possibly have others who know them try to help them in a more, engaging, comfortable way. I mean, it's
Mm.
hard to be vulnerable with complete strangers.
Yeah.
And if someone may just not be comfortable getting there, I've had coaching over the years where they would say, not everybody communicates the way you do.
Yep.
So part of leadership is about knowing when you're the major and they're the minor, and when they're the major and you're the minor in accomplishing something.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. You mentioned in the past that you weren't always known as a connector or as maybe being the most vulnerable person. What triggered it? I mean, did you have to teach yourself this, or what prompted you to all of a sudden be like, hey, you know what? I'm not this type of person anymore. I am going to be vulnerable. I am going to be a connector. Did something happen to make you want to do that?
It's always been in me. I mean, if you go back to when I was in high school or in college, I was like the mom. I was the person that people came to when they had breakups, when they had issues at home, if they had an eating disorder. I was always the person who they came to. And for many years on the teams I was with, I was always the person who made sure people had fun. I was the one who made sure there was, I'll just say diffusing drama. But when I got into roles that were executive roles at the firm, it wasn't a necessity. I was the chief operating officer for our business. It was important that I had a vision and could do things. I was our transformation officer. In the way I talked about it, it was really about setting a vision and what people's life would be like if we all agreed to the change. And I was probably always considered very personable. I think my style is I am risk adverse unless I think the risk that I'm taking is important, bigger than the mission at hand. So when this whole situation came out around the pandemic, I took a risk. And I remember having a few partners call me up and say, you're overreacting. It's not that big a deal. Our people are fine. And then once I got confidence by this sort of how people responded to it, that it actually was not only working, it was probably the most important skill I could bring to the organization right now. They say this, there's a saying, right? There are certain leaders for certain times. I always had it in me, but it was something I didn't think was important to use. And when I did it, it gives me a ton of energy. And now if you fast forward, it's not just the pandemic and all the unrest from that. It's just constant unrest hitting our people. And it's something that I realize is working. So it was there. I did probably, if it weren't for the pandemic, I'm not sure I would have opened up the Pandora's box.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's been such an important topic, especially during the pandemic. And to be honest, I don't know if we're ever going to go back to being non-vulnerable leaders. I think this has really shown why it's so important to connect with each other, to be human, and hopefully, we won't go back to, the stereotypical office space manager coming by looking for your TPS reports. You also mentioned something else that I thought was interesting. You said during a meeting one time you teared up a little bit and you felt weak. And one of the things that I keep hearing from people is they want to know, how can they be vulnerable at work without being perceived as being weak? Or is that just part of being vulnerable?
Yeah, it's everything is in balance, Jacob. There are people that are quiet leaders, and
Yeah.
and that sounds like an oxymoron to people. Well, how are you a quiet leader? It's really that's the person who uses their voice in certain times, in certain ways. They don't have to be bold and flashy, but they're respected. So I think, this concept of vulnerable, you don't want to be 24/7 vulnerable
Yeah.
because you could end up getting this brand of weak. And it's how, as I said before, it's a part of a set of dimensions of a leader. It's not the only thing you are. I do want to mention this. I often talk at work about the importance of your brand. And
Yeah.
I do think for your listeners, it's really important that you think about this, particularly when you're younger in your career, although you could evolve it. I definitely have now evolved my brand, but it's hard to do. And I think about it as the elevator. The door closes. Jacob just walked out, and between a couple floors, a few people talk about you. And what would they say? And that's your brand. And you need to decide early on, do you want to shape the brand? Do you like what people are saying? Do you want to adjust it? And don't think it's something that others control. You can control it.
Yeah.
And so when you get back to this vulnerability piece, if that's the only thing they're saying about you, then you could risk yourself being viewed as weak. I'm certain the person is more than vulnerable. And so I would say think about it in balance and think about what are the other things that you want to be known for that make the vulnerability an effective way of communicating.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, you don't just want to be known as Lara, the vulnerable person, but you also want to be known for, courageous, bold, decisive, and vulnerable. Great like it's like you said, it's a big part of your personal brand. So what is your personal brand, would you say? So if you got out of the elevator and I was talking to a couple people about you, what do you want your personal brand to be?
I think authentic and vulnerable, clearly, somebody who is courageous and selfless, puts their family first, which is something I've tried to set it as an example, and really willing to push the envelope to move us so that we're always on our front foot. And
Yeah.
those are the things I've tried to do over my time here at Deloitte, and as well as with our clients.
Do you found that after you started to open up and you became more transparent and authentic and vulnerable, did those around you do the same, or did they not change their behavior or ways of acting at work?
Not everybody changed, but some did. I mean, there are, at my level, you're probably working with 40, 50-year-old
Yeah.
professionals who've been doing this a long time. It's hard to change behaviors at that point, and it wasn't why I did it. But I will say, in the meetings I am in, there's generally a comfortableness to have conversation, to have chit chat, to share what's going on. But I also don't push it. I know there's a few people that are comfortable maybe opening up, but maybe more in a one-on-one setting. So it's
Hmm.
and it's okay,
Yeah.
right? Because back to not everybody's going to be the same. As long as someone's not toxic, it's okay if they're not the most vulnerable. As long as they're not, shutting down people's willingness to open. We talk, and I'm sure we'll talk about diversity. But one thing, and again, vulnerability is just a piece of it. When you bring people together, you are looking to create an inclusive environment, not an assimilation environment. And so bringing in somebody who's vulnerable and saying, well, you now need to act like other people is not what we're looking to do. We're also not trying to take somebody who's not vulnerable and have them be a weeping willow, but also be somebody who's open to those types of environment and not be toxic.
Makes sense. What about the impact that it had on people who work for you? So maybe not at your level, but maybe your team members, maybe entry-level employees or mid-level employees. Have you noticed any difference that your vulnerability and openness has had on them?
Yes, and this is probably it's hard for me because I told you I like to be a selfless leader, so I try not to say that this is all the things I'm doing, but I would say in conversations I have with our teams, I do drop-ins with our teams, talking to, I'll just, if I'm totally honest, recruiters who talk to our people. There is a difference.
Yeah.
There's a view that they know through these conversations and through vulnerability there's trust and transparency. There were times in the midst, the worst of times, if I didn't have an answer, I told them that. And I would say, I don't know the answer today, but as soon as I know, you're going to know. And then I followed that up with when I knew to give them an answer. And that created a trusting and transparent relationship. And then you start to hear the teams are having team meetings that you're not at, and they're starting to talk in a much more open environment. And then I get notes back after that. So again, I wouldn't say it's every single person, but I think in the last 2 years we've become a more open and trusting organization, at least in the places I see.
And I forgot to ask you actually earlier, how many employees do you guys have in your particular division?
About 15,000.
15,000. Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit now about another topic you're very passionate about. That's diversity and inclusion. I know you've been a big champion of that at your company. And I think that also does play very much into the theme of vulnerability and empathy and compassion. So, can you share a little bit about why diversity and inclusion has been such an important topic to you? And have you been seeing any impact that these initiatives have been having on your people, on your culture, on engagement?
Yeah, so I'll start with maybe the personal side and then I'll get to the professional side. I talked about my women upbringing, and I would say working through an organization, Deloitte's a great organization, but you're still working in an environment with clients and an organization as a woman leader. It's not easy. There are times that many times you're the only woman in the room, and as I've grown up, that aspect of diversity has always been something I've taken, I'll just say very, very personally. But probably, Jacob, the thing that most impacted me really came from my own family and an experience I had with my son when he was young, where, he was considered, by his classmates and many others to be different than them. He socially did not interact with them in the ways they wanted to be interacted with. He uh, didn't make eye contact. He wasn't a sports kid. And when things bothered him, he liked to escape reality. He would go and he would plop a book in his lap in the middle of a playground just to get away from these kids. And he had issues for so many years dealing with bullying and taunting and treating him differently. And the teachers would always tell me how wonderful he was And then you fast forward to his middle school years where he's just starting to feel like he's gaining some traction, and he gets diagnosed with epilepsy.
Oh my goodness.
And now all of a sudden he has to sit in the front row of a bus because they're afraid he's going to have a seizure. He can't do after school activities if the nurse isn't there. So this kid for 13 years, 14 years is just dealing with, again, just he's being taunted by these bullies. Those years are not easy for anybody, Jacob.
No.
The middle school years, it was particularly tough. So when he was going to high school, he asked to go to a different school. He did not want to go to the school that he was in. And long story short, we got him into a school. His sister asked him how the school was for him, and he said, "It's great. I finally found a place that I feel included." And it really became so real to me of how important that was. And if you combine that with what we were seeing outside our doors of Deloitte, and I'm embarrassed that I've been here for so long to see the impacts of George Floyd on our people, and not just our Black professionals, any vulnerable cohort in our organization or broadly watches something like that.
Yeah.
And I honestly think of the pandemic as I call it Noah's Ark. This is intentional, and this is a way for us all to be on the ark, and you can't miss something. There was no way you could be a human being and not see that. So there's a lot of humanity that came into this. From a business perspective, if you think about diversity, I would simply say, if you have 10 people in a room that all think the exact same way, they were brought up the same way, have the same values and beliefs, you're going to get the same answer from all 10 of them each and every time. But if you're running a world-class organization, you want to be a place where you bring people, whether it's their skin color, their gender identity, their race, their religion, all those things will then all of a sudden lead you down a path that you're getting different perspectives. And if any organization can unlock the different perspectives to get the best of all of it, then it's a nirvana. So really focusing on the diversity that people you bring in to make sure you get that, giving those people opportunity through equity. And then, of course, inclusion is incredibly important in making sure all the voices are heard and people can be their authentic selves. So it's a huge passion. And we could talk about accounting and what it means there, but it's immense, not just to us at Deloitte, it's immense to the world. And I think right now we need more than ever some courageous voices to really acknowledge that. We're in a moment like my mom in the 60s. I think we're in a moment, and if we just let it go, we'll be right back to the way we were.
This episode is brought to you by Namely. With the workforces continuing to evolve, it's more important than ever to keep in pace with the nature of business. But it can be even harder to stay ahead and keep employees connected and engaged. That's why you should check out Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that offers everything you need to tackle any curveballs that 2022 throws your way. Whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees, Namely helps you easily adapt to the ever-changing workplace. With onboarding, performance management, payroll, and intuitive benefits enrollment all in one connected modern platform. Companies are built on people. Stay ahead of business trends and don't let either fail. Learn more about making the switch to Namely today at namely.com. Don't wait. That's Namely, NAMELY.com. Can you share about some of the initiatives that you guys have going on at your company around this? Maybe some people might get inspired to implement and test out some of the things that you guys are doing.
Well, I'll start with one area very focused on accounting. So on average, every year there are 1,200 students coming out of college that are eligible to be a certified public accountant. You do need 150 credits to get a license to be a certified public accountant. And if you look at Black students, we have 1,200 every year that have that eligibility coming out of school. If you think about the number of accounting jobs that are in need, when you look at the profession I'm in or places beyond that, you start to realize that that's a woefully short number.
Yeah.
So part of our focus this year was to develop something called Make Accounting Diverse and Equitable, MADE. And we spent our time, rather than just throwing money at it, really starting to understand, like, what are the barriers? What are the root causes that are giving rise to this? And it starts with, if you are a Black or Latinx kid growing up in an urban neighborhood, is there an accountant that you could even look at? What do you think an accountant would do? and really starting to focus on that aspect of someone's life. So we have investments and efforts to get into communities as we speak, into high schools, to have my Firehouse 123 experience. I don't know if anybody's going to get the warm fuzzies like I did, but at least to know what an accountant is and what it's not,
Yeah.
and what it would take to get there. We're also investing money in colleges, HBCUs, to help advance more PhDs and professors that look like the students they want to attract. Getting more Black professors in, helping people get their education needs, helping them with curriculums to be like a world class school anywhere on this planet. And then we're focused on the financial barrier, that getting that fifth year of college is a financial barrier. If you even have enough finances to go to college, to go to a fifth year is even more expensive. So we are giving scholarships out to Black and Latinx students to fund that fifth year. And then we're also, for those who join Deloitte, giving them the time and space they need to pass the CPA exam. We started a program called Stride to do that. And we've also got a current workforce Black and Latinx focus on CPAs, helping people that have been working for 5, 10, 15 years to help them evolve their career. I'd love to think over time that this effort that we're doing attracts others, people's dollars, and quite frankly, their mind share. And we become the convener of how do we address the need to have more diverse accountants and CPAs into the future. And this is a long, long effort.
Yeah.
One, it's really hard to do these things. You can't measure 1 year. Although I do see some progress relative to the number of people we've brought in, and I would say the qualitative reactions, but diversity, equity, inclusion, particularly these types of issues, because they happen outside our doors, are going to take many, many years to resolve.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's an important issue, but it's also a challenging one to make a lot of progress on. And I think more organizations, I think more organizations are starting to take it seriously and putting their investments in that space. But it absolutely does take time, like you said. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to focus a little bit on you. And I'm curious, over the past 2 years, as we've been going through the pandemic, all the crazy events of the past few years, what did you learn about yourself as a leader and as a person?
Well, maybe a few things. One, I'll analogize this to my kids who are in high school. When you're in high school and you're taking things like algebra, you'll often hear words around the kitchen table like, "Will I ever use this?" And I would say the last 2 years, things that I did in my career that at the time were important, but maybe didn't seem important again, all of it came together in a really, really important way. Courage, and the moments I had to be courageous or be selfless, all of a sudden became part of everything I did every day. Trust and transparency, and making sure people felt like they could trust the voice and trust the commitments. And that was something that, again, I would say I had done over the years, but it came together, and it made me start to realize that these life lessons as a leader, it's no different than a marathon or training for the Olympics. You're constantly training, and then all of a
Mm,
sudden you need to have some leadership skills come, and you're doing this. There's no playbook for running an organization through a pandemic.
yep.
There's no pandemic for dummies book in the library to go pick up. You start to realize as a CEO that it's about a lot of this is going to be instinct, and you're pulsing sensing. You're not pulsing hard data, which a lot of leaders like. They like to have all
Yeah.
of the information so that they can theoretically foolproof the decision. And I would say I learned a lot in the last couple of years that I just have to go with my instinct. And maybe lastly, sometimes it's better to not make a decision at all. And
Hmm.
when it's not about not having the facts, but you don't have to rush to everything. Not everything needs to get a solve for. You really need to make sure you think through things. So a lot in there, but I would say a lot of it came together, and leadership is a bit of a marathon.
Yep.
And you'll have quick people to tell you what you're doing well or not doing well. But again, you're trying to solve for most, not for all.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, it's good that you're able to reflect and identify what you've learned about yourself as a person and as a leader over the last 2 years. I think for a lot of people, it's a very difficult question for them to answer, and they don't always have a response. So clearly, this is something that you've thought about and have been reflecting on. When you look at just the world in general and some of the changes that we're starting to see, what are some of the things that you are particularly paying attention to? Are there any trends, any events, things that you think are going to be playing an important role in work and business or even in life?
Yeah, probably a few things. Clearly, the pace of change and the digitization, and I'll just say the amount of technology impacting every aspect of our life is going to happen faster, more
Yep.
dramatically. And on one hand, it comes with great opportunity and great benefits, right? The fact that you and I didn't have to drive to some location today to have this great time together. There's technology that's done it for us. And as you said earlier, this vulnerability aspect, I do think it allows for people to be in each other's homes and each other's spaces, and that just brings down a lot of barriers. So there's a lot of
Yep.
good. I think it'll help us make better business decisions, and I think broadly it'll be good for society. But it does run the risk of too much too fast without people understanding the unintended consequences or intended consequences that creates more, I'll say, haves and have nots. So if you think about all of the technology around data and people knowing what you're right now, someone knows exactly what you and I are talking about. What does that mean? Decisions are being made right now about healthcare choices and through AI. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that comes with technology, but there's a lot of risks that people should be thinking about. And I know there's this immense focus on STEM and STEM skills, which I think
Yep.
is going to be really important in the future. But we can't let go of empathy and emotional quotients, which is really important. So I think that aspect, and that really gets to our role collectively to build a world for the future. And that's probably the second trend. You're just starting to see, again, I hope like diversity, equity, inclusion broadly, a real commitment to the environment and making this a sustainable planet. I mean, I want my kids to have kids here and for their kids to have kids here and have a wonderful life. But if we keep running the path we are, we're at risk of not doing that. And we have a responsibility to be really focused on that. Those things together are going to create a different workforce of the future. So the
Hmm.
things I think about slash worry about is one, the skills that people will need are going to be dramatically different than the skills we had. Some jobs that have existed for years aren't going to be jobs in the future because they're going to be replaced by technology. Having people,
Which jobs do you think are going to be replaced, and which skills do you think are going to be more in demand?
well, so anything that is, I'll say, a routine type of I don't want to scare people that are listening. So I'll give an example, and then they can take this
Okay.
away. So, and this is I'm going back probably 8 years ago, where we built the world built an artificial intelligence technology to translate.
Okay.
If you think about translators, by their nature, are jobs. They work with the UN, and the translating machine was to translate The Little Prince, the French book, The Little Prince.
Okay.
And the first time it got it about 30% right, the second time 60, the third time 90. By the fifth or sixth time, not only was it perfectly translating The Little Prince, it was actually coming up with nuances between the French and English language.
Hmm.
That's how good AI can be relative to the things it can do when the right environment's around, as well as automation. If you look at blockchain as an example, any career that's I'll say an intermediary. So if you think about when you go buy a house or an apartment, there's this whole effort to figure out who owns the title to the house.
Yep.
It's a crazy thing, and you get title insurance. If you start to think of the role of blockchain, it could be an intermediary of all title among owners and sellers of houses, and you start to realize there's not a need, a healthcare processor. So the people that are in the middle, you start to see technology will take those roles, and then anything that can be automated is ultimately going to be a role that
Yep.
that a technology can do. It will never do the human heart, and that's why it's important that the humans don't give up. But it will change the types of skills you have. You will need to understand technology and be able to, if you're back to using AI, you'll have to be able to um, understand what the AI is telling you. You can't just take it on its face. You have to be able to, to evaluate and analyze it.
Hmm. All right. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I know you were talking about some of the other
Well,
things.
I was just going to say those two things together, the intersection of what I'll refer to as being a socially responsible person/organization, and an organization and society that's evolving into a very set of rapid change in a world that right now, quite honestly, is a bit uneasy with a fair amount of unrest, is going to take different types of leaders and different types of professionals in the future. And so I worry that back to the vulnerability topic, that we stop doing it and we go back to being, no offense, Jack Welch, if you're listening, although he's passed away, so he can't be. That was a type of CEO back in the day where you were very buttoned up, you didn't interact with your people, and you just sort of made directions and orders from the center. We're going to need different types of people to create that trusting environment to help people navigate the change. And I'm also not sure everybody wants a career. So as they look into this, is it about having 10 jobs in a lifetime, or is it about having a career? Or is it about doing a lot of different things? What's going to be, and we've heard this for many generations, as you know, but I do think we're sort of heading into the first time through this great resignation. Some of this could be the output of the pandemic on people, but I think a big part of it is people just sort of taking stock in what they do and saying, is this something I really want to do? Do I want to be Lara? Do I want to be in the same organization for 20, 25 years?
Yeah.
And as I look to the future, the combination of different skills, the continued unrest, and maybe the changing desires of the workforce, that's going to be a lot to be solved in the next 10 to 20 years.
It's funny because I actually had Jack Welch, his successor, on my podcast a little while ago, Jeff Immelt. And he was telling me one of the biggest mistakes that he thinks he made during his career is not saying, I don't know enough, not being vulnerable enough. And it's great of him to be able to admit that, but it's interesting after he's reflecting back that he realizes that that's something that he definitely should have done. So you mentioned vulnerability again. I know this has been kind of a big theme for us. So maybe the last few questions on this to wrap up. For people inside of organizations who are looking to be able to create this kind of a culture, being more open, transparent, and even more vulnerable, are there certain variables that you think need to be in place to allow that kind of culture to flourish? And what are some of the barriers that would kill any hope of that happening inside of an organization?
Yeah, well, maybe a couple things. When I think about this, really gets to the heart of culture, right? You're talking about what's the culture of an organization, and do we want to evolve to being a more vulnerable, open culture? And when you think about culture, there's really two things to think about. One is enablement, and the other is accountability over time. So enablement is, you can't just expect everybody the next day to be able to do something that they're not skilled to do or don't know how to do. So it's really starting to bring people on a path of what does it mean to be vulnerable. And if we're at a beginner, it may just be, being more sensitive to the things that are happening outside our doors and saying, maybe you want to check in with your people and just say, how you doing? You don't need to be expert at it. Just need to be in a position to do a check-in with your people. And over time, helping your people's enablement to create more environments where they know how to deepen that level of vulnerability. But the accountability piece is also important. So things that I'll say would kill it on site is, I mentioned the toxic people.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned Jeff ML, because I also got to hear him speak when he talked about transforming GE at the time. Now, this is probably going 8-9 years ago. And I saw him right as I was leading our transformation. And I remember him talking about that when you're going to make a change, there's like 10% of your organizations probably already ran across the bridge. You could probably get 60 to 70 if you engage them. And if you were green lighting them, you'd say the green lights are across the bridge, the yellow lights are sort of on the bridge. Those are people that just need a bit of a nudge. And then there's the people that are left behind. You don't want those people to be toxic.
Yeah.
And so it gets to really engaging them and saying, well, it's okay if you're not comfortable doing it, but please don't, pull this away, and letting people know that from a performance management perspective, they're not going to be harmed by opening up and saying, I'm having a really hard day. This event happened outside. I just need some time away from work. This is a real focus on mental health and well-being, which is a big topic for us. And if you start to make people feel like, on one hand, you're telling them to be vulnerable, but then the implications of doing are personal and not good, that would be dead on arrival from my perspective.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to just say, be vulnerable. But if you as a leader are not vulnerable and you're not leading by example, you could tell people to do whatever you want. Nobody's going to do it. So I think that's definitely an important lesson. And maybe one last question on this is, for people who want to be more vulnerable, transparent, authentic, and to create a culture that embraces this inside of their organizations, any suggestions on where to start, how to make this a reality? I mean, what if you're not a leader in your company and you want to open up and connect with others? How do you go about doing this in a way that I don't know, makes sense?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. One, and it gets back to not having all the answers. I would test what you want to do with others. So if you have people that are your mentors, your advocates, or peers that you trust, and you're thinking that you're entering a weekly meeting and you want to do something different to create the tone in the room, I would talk to some other people and say, what if I kicked off the meeting and I said this, how do you think this would resonate? And do this with a few people because sometimes you're going to find out, depending on who you're talking to, you may get a different answer. But at least it starts to give you a sense of what the reaction would be. And make it simple. Being vulnerable doesn't mean coming in and talking about your deepest fears. It really could start with a reflection of something that happened over the weekend that maybe was good or bad about your kids. And, I tell this a lot to our people. Most of us have kids, not all. So for the
Yeah.
ones that do, it's a very relatable topic. And so talking about your kids is an easy thing to do. Talking about sports is an easy thing to do. So there's
Yeah.
ways to be vulnerable without going to the immediately to the deepest fear. Test it with others, and ultimately it should give you energy. And so if you're doing something and it's not giving you energy, then you're either shouldn't be doing it or you should be doing it somewhere else because it's not working for you. So just have a pulse on the energy level coming out of that engagement, but ask others and keep it simple and work up from there.
I love it. Well, to end the interview, I have just a couple of fun rapid fire questions for you before we end. Starting off with, what has been your most embarrassing moment at work?
Oh God, there's so many. I would probably say, uh, no, I hate to say it, the time I cried. It was a really important meeting, and everybody was nice about it, but I got up out of the room saying, I can't believe I let it go so far. I teared up. I didn't
Yeah.
cry, but I would say for me that would probably be the most
What
embarrassing.
what made you tear up? Are you allowed to share?
Well, it's just an interaction with an old friend, and I was doing something I thought was right for the firm, maybe not right for her, and I felt really bad about it, and I was saying, I'm sorry, you feel this way, and they were pretty cold, so it
Yeah.
made me realize that I took it too personally. They were really good at compartmentalizing it all.
Okay. All right. That's a good one. What are you most proud of?
Um, I'm really proud of how our people have dealt with the last few years. We've run a business, 15,000 people from their parents' homes, their apartments, their own homes, having to deal with, all the things you and I are dealing with every day. I am so proud that they get up every day and they're focused on doing what we need to do. But most importantly, we talk all the time about them being there for each other and for our communities. And and we're talking about the pandemic, but it's so many things. It's
Yeah.
the weather in Texas, it's the tornadoes, it's things over and over, and they just pick up and help each other. So the resilience of our organization, and then I would say even my own family, watching my two kids just deal with the fact that their high school years are not the same. So
Yeah.
just proud of how we're all just getting through this.
What is a leadership tip or hack or strategy that you have used during your career that has enabled you to become more successful?
Um, you may be able to tell from the call. I like to inject humor in every once in a while. So I think sometimes not being super serious is really important. You got to know when to use it and when not to. But that's another element of creating a comfortable environment. I often talk about how I'm a big Mets fan, and it's probably not something you want to actually openly admit. That's another vulnerable example, except a fun one for people. So I would just say don't take it too seriously. Know when to inject a little humor. And what I think about sometimes is when we're all moved on, will I look back And will somebody say, she made a difference? And that name Lara, will it just be will it be Lara and Jacob who were they, or will it be they made a difference? Because we spend a lot of our personal time in life doing this. So don't keep it too serious.
All right, and last two questions for you. One is, have you ever had a coach or a mentor who had an impact on your career, and were you able to share what they did or even who that was?
Yeah, so I had a senior partner I worked with for many, many years. He retired in the last year or two. His name is Greg Durant. He has always been somebody who pushed me to do things I wasn't sure I could do. He brought me out to, at the time, our largest audit client. I was a senior manager, young senior manager. I won't get into all the complexities. I'll just say it was the largest and probably most complex client we had. And he told me I was going to be the lead senior manager. And I'd been working for about 2 weeks in this new role. And the client kept coming to me and asking me questions that were so technical, and I had paralysis. For 2 weeks I didn't answer a question, and of course he must have gotten wind of it. And he asked me if I would go get a drink with him, and I was like, no, I can't. I'm getting married in a week or two. And he was like, well, you don't have a choice. And as good as he is, he knew what was going on, and he got me into the car and he said, well, how do you think everything's going? And I was like, it's okay. And he knew. He said, listen, do you know why I brought you here? I have great confidence in you. You're going to do awesome. Answer those questions. And if you get it wrong, I have your back. And not only did this give me the confidence I needed at the time, it also became a reminder to me of how to help others by giving them the confidence they need when they need it. So, he's always been a great mentor. I've had many, but that's one thing that stands out for me.
I love it. And very last question for you. Is there a leadership book or podcast or resource, anything that you recommend for people to check out that you think will help make them better, more effective leaders? And again, it could be anything.
Well, I'm a big Adam Grant fan, and he's not one that you have to spend a lot of time with. He's got some great, great quotes. I do think I mentioned earlier the focus on technology. I would say there's a whole bunch of them I can name, but I would get out and start for people that really want to lead into the future, to understand where technology is going and combine that with leadership. Broadly, I'll tell you, I'm like a Michelle Obama, Madonna fan. And to me, the lessons there are about just constant transformation of skills and just an excitement to be here.
Yeah, no, those are great. Well, Lara, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share your insights with me. Where can people go to learn more about you, your company, anything that you want to mention or share for people to check out?
Well, I have a LinkedIn and a Twitter account that I'm pretty active on, so I would say that's probably a good place to start. I'm not sure of my handle. I should know this offhand, but if you type in Lara Abrash, I don't think you're going to get more than one. And I do like to post thoughtware and things like that on there, and would love to engage more broadly with your listeners.
Very cool. Well, thanks again for joining me, and thanks everyone for tuning in. My guest again has been Lara Abrash, Chair and CEO of Deloitte Touche LLP, and I'll see you next week. Thanks again for tuning into today's episode. Please remember to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred channel is. I cannot express how important those reviews and ratings are to the success of this show, and they keep allowing me to bring back amazing guests. Lastly, don't forget to check out the brand new PDF that I just put out, which looks at the evolution of the employee. In other words, how employees are evolving and changing, and what you as an organization should do to adapt. You'll get a complete breakdown of what that evolution looks like, as well as action items that you can and should be taking. That PDF is available at thefutureemployee.com. And if you want to reach out to me for whatever reason, whether it's inviting me to speak, sponsoring the show, or just giving me some feedback, you can always do so. My email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Again, that's jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.